On the morning of May 5th, 1994, Susan Hanley, 65, stood with a group of fellow adventurers in the dense forests of West Virginia. They were there for a wild caving expedition, led by Danny Gillespie, a 50-year-old experienced guide. The group was a mix of seasoned cave explorers and beginners, all excited for the adventure ahead. The promise of rugged terrain, underground rivers, and the stunning beauty of Norman Cave excited them. Before entering the cave, they went over basic safety instructions, how to navigate tricky passages, stay close to the guide, and the overall plan for the day. The trip was expected to last several hours, with a visit to a beautiful waterfall inside the cave before heading back. The air was crisp and the excitement was high, but little did Susan know that this adventure would change her life in ways she could never imagine. Before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. As always, viewer discretion is advised. As the group entered Norman Cave, they were greeted by the wide and welcoming entrance, with smooth limestone walls damp from groundwater. The air was cool and still, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the cave. At first, the passage was easy to navigate, with plenty of space to move. But as they ventured deeper, the ceiling lowered, and the group had to duck to avoid protruding formations. The air grew colder, and the silence became heavier, pressing down on them. The atmosphere was both eerie and breathtaking. After about 600 feet into the cave, the passage narrowed, and the group reached a tricky section, a ledge running above an underground stream. The only way forward was to cross this ledge, requiring careful steps. Everyone moved cautiously, using the dim lights of their helmets to see, and Susan, staying near the middle of the group, followed, trusting the others to guide the way. As Susan carefully followed the group across the narrow ledge, disaster struck in an instant. In one moment of misjudgment, she veered slightly left toward an opening she hadn't noticed before. It was a small passage, barely visible in the dim light. As she took a step forward, her boot suddenly met empty air. Before she could react, she was already slipping, and the weight of her body pulled her into the hole. Panic surged through her as she tried to twist her body to catch herself, but the slick, smooth walls offered no grip. She plunged down the 27-foot slope, tumbling uncontrollably. Her body twisted and rolled, and in a frantic attempt to stop, her helmet slammed into the walls, sending flashes of pain through her head. She crashed into rocks, her body unable to find any control as gravity pulled her down faster. The fall had begun. As Susan tumbled down the narrow tunnel, the pain was overwhelming. She could feel the sharp rock scraping against her skin as she twisted and turned, desperately trying to stop her fall. Her helmet hit the walls with brutal force, and her shoulders slammed into the narrow passages. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the cave as her left leg struck a protruding rock, sending a searing pain through her body. The fall continued, and her body, now uncontrollable, plunged even deeper. When she finally landed, her feet struck the rocky floor with an intense force. The impact was so strong that her bones shattered instantly, and the pain shot through her legs and up her spine. Susan was thrown onto her side, and a sickening crack vibrated through her back as her vertebrae broke. In an instant, darkness closed in around her, and the sound of rushing water nearby became the last thing she heard. Above ground, chaos erupted as the group realized something was terribly wrong. One of the cavers shouted Susan's name, and others scrambled toward the ledge to look down into the hole where she had disappeared. Their headlamps flickered across the jagged rocks, and beams of light danced along the cavern's edges. One man from the group bravely made his way down the steep passage, using his arms and legs to steady himself as he descended. When he reached the bottom, the sight of Susan's crumpled, half-submerged form shocked him. Blood ran down her face, and her breathing was shallow. He immediately called for help. More rescuers arrived, and together they worked quickly to clear the rocks trapping her. They used whatever tools they had to break away the brittle stone, freeing her from the narrow stream bed. Every movement caused Susan immense pain, but they managed to lift her onto a small, dry ledge above the water, where they could try to help her. As the rescuers continued their efforts, the situation grew even more urgent. Gillespie, realizing the severity of the situation, rushed back toward the cave entrance to call for emergency help. Outside, dusk had already settled, and the cold air made the trek even harder. By the time Gillespie made it to the surface, he was soaked in sweat and breathless, but he managed to radio for assistance, triggering a high-risk rescue operation. The first wave of rescuers, 40 in total, including paramedics, cave explorers, and search and rescue specialists, descended into the cave armed with medical equipment, ropes, and stretchers. The team fought against the freezing cold in the narrow, cramped passageways. When they reached Susan, she was barely conscious, her body shutting down from hypothermia. They immediately wrapped her in emergency blankets to try to warm her, but the dampness of the cave air made it difficult to preserve her body heat. The team splinted her broken leg and immobilized her spine to prevent further injury, knowing the slightest wrong movement could make things worse. The hardest part of the rescue was yet to come, getting Susan out of the cave. The narrow, winding passages made it nearly impossible to carry her on a stretcher. The rescuers had to carefully maneuver her through tight squeezes, where there was barely enough space for a single person. They passed Susan along in a slow, agonizing relay, inch by inch, as exhaustion set in. The cold, damp conditions made every movement harder. The team's clothes were soaked, and their fingers numbed as they gripped ropes and braced against the jagged rock. Hours dragged on, and they fought through pain and fatigue, knowing that Susan's life depended on their efforts. By midnight, they were finally close to the entrance. The final ascent was brutal, requiring teamwork, pulleys, and sheer strength. When Susan was finally pulled into the open air, the rescuers collapsed from exhaustion, their faces streaked with mud and sweat. An ambulance was waiting nearby, and Susan was rushed to safety, drifting in and out of consciousness as the voices around her faded. Susan's recovery was long and painful, with her injuries leaving her with permanent mobility issues. The trauma of the fall haunted her, and her anger grew as she believed the accident resulted from negligence. She felt the guide, Danny Gillespie, had failed to mark the dangerous passage properly, and that the cave should have been better regulated for safety. Her family supported her, and they filed a lawsuit against Gillespie and the commercial caving company. However, the legal battle stretched on for months, and the jury ultimately decided Susan was 70% at fault for the accident, acknowledging her responsibility for veering off the safe path. No damages were awarded, but the case set a new precedent for commercial caving operations. The incident led to improved safety protocols, with guides becoming more vigilant in marking hazards. For Susan, the cave had taken much from her, her mobility, her sense of security, but it also gave her a deep respect for the unforgiving nature of the underground world. It taught her, and others, that adventure is full of risks, and while some places are meant to be explored, they do not always guarantee safety. Always prioritize safety over excitement when exploring dangerous terrains. Trust your guide, but also be aware of your surroundings. Don't rush or ignore caution signs. Accidents can happen in an instant, and preparation can mean the difference between adventure and tragedy. Respect nature's power.